Jordan Schultz joins us. Always great to be joined by the NFL insider for theScore. Insider for all sports is how we will introduce him. Jordan Schultz with us on OutKick 360. Jordan, good to see you, man.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, scenario for you, and I want to get to Derek Carr in a moment, but I think it all centers around Aaron Rodgers and what he wants to do. If Rodgers emerges from this darkness retreat, from his cave, if he awakes like Groundhog Day and says, you know what, I saw something and it says I'm staying with the Green Bay Packers, what do the Green Bay Packers do?
I would be very surprised if he's a Packer next year. If he comes back and says, I really want to be here, let's run it back. I don't know how you say no to that, considering where the roster is, the synergy that he's built with Matt LaFleur. I mean, it's not perfect, but that would be really hard to say no to. I just don't see a scenario where that happens. I mean, listen, he's owed, I think, something like $50 million next year from them. He ultimately, I think the Jets, I mean, that's their guy. That's their top target. I know Derek Carr is there today, but they still want Aaron Rodgers. I think the ultimate for them is him for 2 years to help get this young roster that's very talented to the next level. But to answer your question, I guess I would be really surprised if that happened. And if it did, I guess they would also have to think long and hard about what they want, because we do know it's a soap opera every year. And Jordan Love, he may not have had a great first 3 years in terms of not playing, but his mechanics and where he's at now compared to when he came out of Utah State, it's like night and day. I mean, I've talked to really smart football people, much smarter than me, that talk about Jordan Love as being a real guy.
Well, and that sort of leads into my question. You know, there was a time when Jordan Love was drafted, it was clear Aaron Rodgers was done with the Packers and sort of had to get coaxed back in and told all the right things to be back on board. Aaron Rodgers, I think, is probably out on being a Packer and wants to move on and try something else. But is the feeling mutual now? Do you feel like the Packers are probably also in a state of, yeah, we're good. We're good if you want to move on, and we'll try to find you a spot, right? Is this a mutual thing at this point?
I think it is. I think it would benefit both sides because really, I mean, if you look at Green Bay, they have some decisions to make, whether it's Bakhtiari, Rashawn Gary, ultimately, Randall Cobb could retire. They have guys that have been there, Mercedes Lewis, a long time, that they've kept there in large part because they want to make sure Aaron's happy. And he is, he won back-to-back MVPs just the last, right before this season. And obviously they won a Super Bowl. They've had tremendous success. But where the roster is now, to me, listen, I know they can be competitive, but it makes the most sense for both sides to move on, considering what's happened at the end of each season the last several years. I mean, it's almost eerie how similar it is to Brett Favre and how things ended with him and how Aaron supplanted him. And now you have Jordan Love, who was in his mid-20s, was a first-round pick, and I think is probably ready to be the starter. And to me, it would make sense for him to ask for a trade if they go back to Aaron Rodgers, because he's sat so long and he knows the offense now. So, and then Aaron can go somewhere else. Maybe it's Vegas with Devontae Adams and Josh McDaniels. Maybe it's the Jets, but I think it would behoove both sides.
Rodgers in New York with the Jets, with that young roster, and yeah, I mean, there's so many things to point to as to why it would work. So, can you make the same case for Derek Carr if you are Woody Johnson, saying we're a veteran quarterback away? We would love Rodgers, but we can do it with Derek Carr. How tough of a reach is that to make?
I think Derek Carr, well, put it this way. Would you rather have 4 years of Derek Carr or 1 or 2 of Rodgers? I mean, because that's ultimately what you're asking as well. Not just the age. Carr's 32, Rodgers is pushing 40, but also just knowing what we know. But also just knowing what we know about Rodgers and how things play out with him. So I think Rodgers happy and healthy is still a big jump from Derek Carr. I think Carr, I know he's a 4-time Pro Bowler, but he hasn't really done it. He's never been a successful playoff quarterback. And I know Rodgers has had some disappointing exits, but he's won a Super Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
That roster, you talked about it. I mean, Breece Hall, Michael Carter, Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore offensively, and then they drafted really well defensively. Sauce Gardner, obviously, Jermaine Johnson. I mean, they have a lot of guys. Quincy Williams, Quinnen Williams. We'll see what happens in free agency, but that team, I don't know if they're an Aaron Rodgers away from winning the Super Bowl, but if they had Aaron Rodgers, to me, they're an 11-12 win team. They're in the mix. Derek Carr, I think, gets you, double-digit wins perhaps, but you're not that threat that you would be with Rodgers. That's super scary. Either way, it's not going to be Zach Wilson. They realize that was a colossal mistake. I don't know what's going to happen if they're going to trade him or not, but they know they need a quarterback, and I think they are exhausting all options.
Yeah, Jordan, my answer to your question is I'd rather have a Super Bowl, and I think the chance of winning a Super Bowl with 2 years of Rodgers is far greater than 4 years with Carr. So I'm with you on that. My question would be, what are the Saints with Derek Carr? Another team he's visited. What does Derek Carr do for that team right now, given their roster?
I like it for them. I mean, he has the connection with Dennis Allen. They're really hoping, guys, that Michael Thomas becomes the Michael Thomas he was 3 years ago when he was an All-Pro. I think if he was an average player, he wouldn't have been on that roster, and they wouldn't have been as patient as they've been. I think he's a great player, and they hope that a guy like Derek Carr can give him that rejuvenation. And then they drafted Chris Olave, who had a phenomenal rookie year. So you're giving Carr a couple weapons there. We'll see what happens with Kamara from a legal standpoint, but I think he makes New Orleans better. The NFC South is arguably the softest division in the league, especially with Tom retiring. So he makes them better, but he doesn't put them over the top. If you bring in Derek Carr, if you're the Saints, and you have let's say a 4-year commitment, you're saying to your fan base that we're not really rebuilding, but we're also thinking about building. We're not rebuilding, but we're thinking about how to build around Derek Carr and his skill set, because at his age, we believe he's a top 10 quarterback. I mean, he was scheduled to make $40.4 million. He won't get that number, obviously, in New Orleans or anywhere else. But I think the Saints, Mickey Loomis, the GM, is an old school guy. I don't think he wants to wait. And it does send a message to your fan base that we're trying to be competitive.
At Schultz_report is where you can follow Jordan Schultz of theScore. So Greg Roman out in Baltimore. They have an extensive search, plenty of interviews. Lamar Jackson reportedly involved in this search. And we see that Todd Monken ends up taking this job, moving from Georgia, joining John Harbaugh in Baltimore. But you had the report earlier this week, Jordan, that Lamar Jackson was not guaranteed to be part of the equation with their new selection at offensive coordinator. With all of that in mind, is that just Baltimore thinking from their end, we're not really sure what Lamar is going to come back with and want to do?
I was pretty surprised to hear from multiple people that they were not given assurances, the OC candidates, that Lamar would be there next year. Because if you're hiring an OC, you generally want to know who your quarterback is, because that's going to help inform your decision-making process. And Todd Monken, I like the hire. He's going to be a lot different than Greg Roman. I think the idea is to keep Lamar a little bit more upright in the pocket, try to protect him. He's missed 34% of his snaps the last 2 years, 11 games, so they realize that. He's 26. He's a former league MVP. I think they're probably going to tag him exclusively, so he won't be able to negotiate with other teams, and you essentially push this down a year. You could also tag and trade him. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities, but I was surprised to learn that offensive coordinator candidates, and there were a lot of them, were not guaranteed that Lamar would be back next season. You mentioned something too. I can't remember who reported it, but I did read somewhere that Lamar, I want to say, and don't quote me on this, but I want to say he had the opportunity to be involved, but it was almost like he didn't want to be involved. He wasn't interested. I did see that floating out there. I haven't asked to confirm it, but that's interesting.
I guess from with who you've talked to, they didn't confirm that he was a part of the interview process.
I didn't even, to be honest, I didn't even ask. I was so focused on what was happening with Lamar in terms of were the coordinator candidates getting assurances that he'd be there next year. And the fact that they weren't given any assurances, and there was a legitimate, like, we really don't know from John Harbaugh, says a lot to me. And again, he doesn't have an agent too. And so when you're extracting information from an insider standpoint, you basically have three options. You have the team, the agent, and the player. And you want, at least generally, if you can get two, you're in pretty good shape. But Lamar is not talking. The team has been pretty quiet. And there's no agent. So it's tough to gather. That's why I think anyone that says, I know exactly what's happening there, I don't really buy it.
So one team to me that's the outlier, that had been some different reports from, some big NFL insiders like yourself, that link the Titans to both Derek Carr or Aaron Rodgers in a trade. And to me, it's the one that's a little bit out of place, given their current quarterback situation. Because the other teams are the obvious ones that definitely need a quarterback and have a decent roster around that quarterback spot. Is there any validity to the Titans being interested in trying to upgrade, or is it even an upgrade if it's Derek Carr instead of Ryan Tannehill? I got a lot of questions about that team being reported.
Is Derek Carr an upgrade? I mean, maybe a little bit, but Tennessee they're 2 seasons away removed from being the number 1 seed in the AFC. I told you I thought Rand Carthon was going to be a great hire, and I really believe that. And I think him and Vrabel will find that synergy. I don't know if I haven't dug on that yet about Rodgers and Carr potentially going to Tennessee, because I think if you ask me what I think is going to happen, I think Rodgers, I think the Jets and the Raiders, it's going to be one of those two, and I waffle back and forth on it, but I think it's going to be one of those two, and I still think Carr is going to Saints. So I guess that almost answers your question. I would be surprised.
Yeah, no, and you said you love Rand Carthon as the pick for GM for the Titans. How hard is it, though, to try to predict something with a guy who's never been a GM before? Because I'm sure there's a lot of guys you look at in the league and say, I could see this guy doing X, or I could see them swinging big at this position for that. We don't really know with Rand Carthon until he pulls off the big move like, John Robinson pulled off in trading the number 1 pick back in 2016.
Yeah, I would go back to, pedigree and what your situation is, where you came from. And they obviously had the director of pro personnel in San Francisco. They had a tremendous amount of success, and they were able to find quarterbacks, not necessarily that were considered marquee guys. They obviously traded up a lot. They got Trey Lance. We to be determined there. Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant. Jimmy Garoppolo, they traded for with New England, didn't give up a ton. So, you think about that, and you would surmise from that perhaps there wouldn't be a massive move at quarterback. But I don't know if it's just looking at it from realistically, like, I don't know how much sense it makes to bring back Tannehill. Like, maybe it's a cut, maybe it's a trade, but I would be surprised if he ends up QB1 heading into next season. I don't know what's going to happen with Malik Willis, but from a Tannehill perspective, I'd be surprised. And Rand, his background is scouting, and he did a hell of a job. You think about some of the mid-round picks they hit on, Dre Greenlaw, Fred Warner. So to me, the draft would make a lot of sense, and then you can reset the clock from a quarterback standpoint on your cap. So that's, I guess, what I would surmise. But I tell you what, I'm going to be at the combine. I'll be taught, give me another week or two and I'll get more info for you, because I know this is a Titans show. The roster is pretty good, though. I mean, there's a lot to like about it. They need weapons, they need offensive line, but there's still a lot to like about that roster.
Just for my sake, do a favor for me when you're at the combine, and let's find out about Hendon Hooker and the possibility of Hendon Hooker being a first-round pick. That's just something that interests me, and I don't know if it's where the Titans pick, but if there's a trade-down scenario, or if that's a guy that, a Titans-like team that's sort of on the end of having a good quarterback would maybe explore.
I'd say Hendon Hooker is one of the most interesting prospects in the entire draft. A lot of reasons. I mean, obviously, you guys know him well, just down the road in Knoxville, but he has a really interesting skill set. He's got a really good arm, a live arm. I know he's coming off the injury, but I was told he's making great progress. He has competed at the highest of levels, Virginia Tech and Tennessee, and dominated. And I mean, he was a Heisman frontrunner for most of the season. And He throws a beautiful ball, and I am not a quarterback guru, but I've asked scouts about him, and I don't know where he's going to go in the draft. I think he's going to go higher than people think because he checks off all the character stuff. He's phenomenal. He's going to be good on the board. He's super smart. And then he just, his arm talent is really impressive. He's physically big. He's obviously older. I think he'll be 24. He's 24, which is not like super ideal, but he's a guy that, he would make a lot of sense for the Titans. He'd make a lot of sense for a lot of teams. And I think he's going to end up going much earlier than people anticipate.
Jordan Schultz, our guest. It feels as though you need a couple of weeks to gauge some things on prospects, right? Maybe a couple.
The draft stuff tends to fall into place after the combine and when free agency really, after those first couple weeks of free agency.
And maybe a couple of hours until we know about Eric Bieniemy. I just looked. I haven't seen a report that he's actually officially the new OC in Washington. It feels like it's headed that way. I got the sense even last year, and certainly based on comments from Andy Reid right after the Super Bowl, I don't get the sense Kansas City's trying to keep him around, which, again, I think also plays a factor in this. I think that 30,000-foot view is, he wants to leave to get out from underneath Andy Reid. I don't get the sense that the comments I'm hearing from players or coaches, it's not your typical, hey, we love this guy, we got to keep him. Am I wrong?
I think they'd like to keep him, but I feel like, listen, Andy Reid has been super proactive in terms of saying how helpful and talented Bieniemy is. And it's when you watch Super Bowl, you see some of their creative play calling. I mean, Andy Reid gets the credit that I don't know how fair it is because I think it's really a split. I mean, he is a great offensive mind, but Bieniemy is 53. His resume is as good as anyone's.
Yes.
It makes a lot of sense that he'd go to Washington. I reported yesterday that they've wanted, Ron Rivera has wanted Bieniemy to be the guy. He's been there for 2 days. They had dinner back-to-back nights. I think he will be the offensive coordinator. But then you also have, Matt Nagy was brought in by Brett Veach, and he would then assume essentially the offensive coordinator position. And so I guess you could tie that together. But Kansas City would, I think, at the end of the day, would love for Bieniemy to be back. I just think realistically, both sides realize that it's probably best for him, especially if he wants to be a head coach and really get that opportunity to go to a place like Washington, for example, develop Sam Howell, who they really like inside that building. I mean, I just had Jahan Dotson on my show, and he was raving about him, and I've heard that a lot. If he were to develop Sam Howell and get that offense humming, even a year or two, he would have an opportunity to be a head coach potentially. So I think they like him back, but I think realistically, both sides realize it's probably best for him to move on.
What do you think of the staff that Sean Payton's putting together in Denver?
He's not done, but he is. This is why Sean Payton is such a good coach. It's not just the week-to-week preparing game plan and developing a quarterback. It's putting together a staff and being the CEO. This is what the Penner family wanted. They wanted a head coach who could be a CEO and collaborate with George Payton. And maybe that takes some of George Payton power away a little bit, but it gives him an opportunity to focus a lot more on scouting and have an opportunity to have a head coach who can build a staff that is a professional staff. I mean, they had some really good pieces there last year. They lost to DC. That was a killer. But ultimately, Nathaniel Hackett, as a first-time head coach, wasn't ready to be in that position. I think he's a really good offensive coach, but he didn't command that locker room. He lost that locker room really early on, and we saw what happened. So this is why you have Sean Payton. This is why you give up what you did, why you pay him $20 million or whatever it was, because he's going to put together a staff that's going to empower the players to maximize in a way that they just couldn't do with Hackett.
Jordan, final thing, final 60 seconds or so. Chad, we always tease Jordan about talking NBA. We need to tell him about this All-Star Game draft.
Yeah, he's an NBA insider. Is this
Your
report
thoughts?
true that they want to do away with making someone the last pick and have them feel bad? So they want to have the reserves picked first and then the starters taken after.
I saw that, and I can't remember who it was last year, but somebody got picked last, and it wasn't great. It was just kind of bad PR. So I really shifted, honestly, toward the NFL insider, really, just with that. But you're dealing with the ultimate alpha male egos of NBA All-Star, and then to be picked last, it's not.
But they're being picked last of the All-Stars.
I know, but nobody wants to be last.
I think like the old era, the alpha mentality would be, oh, please pick me last because I'm going to let you hear about it when I put up 30 on you against your team again.
Yeah.
Hey, you shouldn't have picked me last in that All-Star game. This is really some ego protection to the next level, I think, when I saw this story.
It is, but I feel like this was only a matter of time because that did not sit well last year. And I don't think anybody, even at this level, wants to be last. Imagine like you have the Pro Bowl, let's say Derek Carr, and he's picked last as the quarterback. He's a 4-time Pro Bowler, but then it's like, I'm actually last. My peers pick me last. That nobody wants that. That's tough.
Just rough. When I see this, that they have to placate to the last
rough
pick.
life for those NBA All-Stars.
Every kid on the playground is picked last, and you don't pick the
That's
reserve.
true.
I mean,
that's true.
It's not the hardest thing to be picked last and then ball out like Chad and I had to do.
I take the Billy Hoyle approach from White Men Can't Jump. I pray that I'm picked last, so I can go get my set shot over in the corner and bury a couple threes and make them pay for it.
Jordan, appreciate you, man. You're our first pick for NFL News. We appreciate you as always.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you guys. Anytime. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan. Appreciate you.
At Schultz _report there from theScore. Great stuff as always from Jordan.